Most men spend their whole lives afraid of losing their money. I spent mine making very sure that nobody ever knew I had any. And it worked. It worked a little too well. Right up until the night my son-in-law leaned across a white tablecloth in front of my daughter in a restaurant full of strangers, smiled at me the way you smile at a child, and told me to know my place. He had no idea that the place he was sitting in, the suit he was wearing, and the paycheck that bought both all traced back through a chain of companies to one signature. Mine. My name is Warren Callahan. I'm 70 years old. 45 years ago, I started a company out of a rented machine shop. One lathe, one used delivery truck. $11,000 I'd saved cutting other men's steel on someone else's clock. That company makes industrial fasteners now, the unglamorous little bolts and brackets that hold together 100 things you touch every day and never once think about. Over 4 decades, it grew. A few thousand employees. A name most people around here would know if you said it out loud. Meridian Industrial. What most people don't know, what almost nobody knows, is that I took Meridian private a long time ago, folded it under a quiet holding company called Ridgeline, and stepped back to a chairman's role I mostly exercise from a small home office. I don't run the day-to-day anymore. I haven't in years. There's a portrait of the founder hanging in the lobby of our headquarters that half the building walks past every morning without a glance. It's a painting of a much younger me. Most of my own employees couldn't pick me out of a crowd. I built it that way on purpose. Not the fame, the anonymity. Because I learned something early, watching money change the people around me, that I've never forgotten. The moment people know what you're worth, you stop ever seeing who they really are. Everyone performs for money. So I put mine away where it couldn't be seen, and I drove my old truck, and I wore my plain shirts, and I watched people be exactly who they were when they thought there was nothing in it for them. I'll give you the clearest picture of it I can. That portrait in the lobby, the young man in the painting, the founder nobody looks at, Trent walked past it every single working day for 4 years. Rode the elevator up past it. Never once turned his head. If he had stopped, even once, and really looked at that face, and then looked across a Thanksgiving table at his wife's father, he might have seen it. The same jaw, the same eyes. But men like Trent don't look at the founder's portrait because the founder is dead history and Trent is the future, and the future doesn't waste time on old men and oil paint. That incuriosity, that certainty that the old are furniture, is the exact blind spot that let all of this happen. He never looked because he'd already decided there was nothing there worth seeing. For 45 years, that quiet has told me the truth about every single person I've let close. 3 years ago, it told me the truth about my son-in-law. Before I tell you that story, do an old man one small kindness. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had you all figured out, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the right person. Give a like as well. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you something I still turn over at night, and I want to know how you'd have answered it. Let me tell you about my daughter first, because everything I did, in the end, I did for Claire. Claire is 34. She's my only child. Her mother, my Peg, passed 4 years ago, and since then Claire has been the whole of my family and the whole of my heart. She's kind the way Peg was kind, the kind that other people mistake for weakness until they need her, and then they find out it's the strongest thing in the room. She works as an art teacher. She never wanted anything to do with the business, and I never pushed her, because I wanted her to have the one thing I'd built the company to make possible, a life she chose freely, unbent by money. 3 years ago, Claire married a man named Trent Marsh. I need to be fair to Trent, so I'll tell you what everyone saw. Trent is impressive on the surface. Sharp suits, firm handshake, always the most confident man in the room. He'd been climbing fast at Meridian. He was a vice president in our procurement division, the department that handles which suppliers we buy from and what we pay them. He and Claire met, of all places, at a company event, and neither of them had any idea that the quiet older man Claire would later introduce as my dad was the founder whose name Trent walked past in the lobby every morning. That's the thing I have to explain because I know it sounds impossible. How does a man not know his own father-in-law owns the company he works for? He doesn't know because I never told him. Claire never told him either. Not to deceive him, but because that was simply how she was raised. We don't talk about money in my family. Peg and I raised Claire to believe that what you're worth has nothing to do with what you own, and she carried that so naturally that it never once occurred to her to inform her boyfriend that her father was wealthy. To Trent, I was Warren, Claire's dad, a retired guy who drove a beat-up pickup, wore the same 3 flannel shirts, and had, in Trent's own words at the rehearsal dinner, done something with trucks or machines or something back in the day. I let him think exactly that, because the quiet was doing its work. And for 3 years I watched. At first, what I saw was ordinary. A young man, a little too impressed with himself, a little too focused on status. Not a crime. Then, slowly, the picture got darker. I watched Trent talk over Claire at every dinner. I watched him correct her in front of people, gently, with a little laugh, in a way that made her a size smaller each time. I watched her stop mentioning her painting, the thing she loved most in the world. He had a way of calling it her little hobby. He said enough times, in that light tone, that she just stopped bringing it up, and I watched my bright, funny, stubborn girl start checking her husband's face before she answered a simple question, reading him first, to see what she was allowed to say. If you've ever watched someone you love get folded down to a smaller size by the person who's supposed to lift them up, you know the exact helplessness of it. You can't point to any one thing. There's never one thing. It's the light going down like a hand easing a dimmer, so slow you can never quite catch it moving, until one day you look up and the whole room is dark and you can't remember when it happened. And I watch how Trent treated me, which, it turned out, told me everything, because Trent had decided early exactly what I was worth to him, which was nothing. I was Claire's broke old dad, a relic, a man who'd done something with machines. And when a man like Trent decides you're worth nothing, he stops performing for you. And that, friend, is when you finally get to see him clearly. He cut me off mid-sentence and turned to talk to someone who mattered. He'd hand me his code at family gatherings like I was staff. Once at a barbecue, he told a story to a group of his friends about Claire's dad, the human time capsule, and did an impression of me squinting at a smartphone. And everyone laughed, and Claire laughed too because she was afraid not to, and I stood there holding a paper plate and smiling and filing it all away. I want to be honest with you about something. None of that hurt me the way you'd think. I'm 70 years old. I've been underestimated by better men than Trent Marsh, and I stopped needing anyone's respect a long time ago. A man who's secure in what he's built doesn't bleed when a boy sneers at him. But every time Trent made Claire smaller, something in me got very still and very cold, because that I could not file away forever. It came to a head on Claire's 34th birthday. Trent had chosen the restaurant, the most expensive place in the city, a place he'd clearly picked so he could be seen picking it. It was Claire's birthday, but everything about the evening was arranged to be about Trent. He ordered for the table without asking. He made a show of the wine list. He mentioned twice a big deal he was about to close at work that was going to change everything for us. And I remember thinking, even then, that I'd have to look into that deal because I knew every major deal moving through my company and I hadn't heard about one attached to Trent's name. And then, over dinner, I made the mistake that sprang the whole thing. Claire had mentioned, shyly, that a local gallery had offered to show a few of her paintings. It was the first time in a year I'd seen her light up, and before I could tell her how proud I was, Trent laughed, that little laugh, and said, "Babe, we talked about this. Nobody's buying finger paintings. You gotta be realistic." And I watched the light go out of my daughter's face on her own birthday. So I did something I almost never do. I spoke up, quietly. I said, "Trent, I think it's wonderful. And I think you might be surprised what people will pay for something made with real heart. I've built a whole life on making things people said nobody wanted." The table went a little quiet. Trent turned to me, and he had the look of a man who'd been challenged by something he considered furniture. And he smiled, and he leaned across that white tablecloth, and he said it. "Warren," with respect. He let the words hang, so everyone could hear. "You drove a truck. You made what bolts? This is a different world than the one you shuffled around in. Business, real business, art markets, none of it is something you'd understand. So how about, at this table, you just know your place? Let the people who actually built something talk. Let the people who actually built something talk." I want you to sit with me in that moment, friend, because I've replayed it 100 times, and every time, the thing that stops my breath isn't Trent's face. It's Claire's. My daughter didn't defend me. She looked down at her plate on her own birthday, and she said nothing. Because 3 years under this man had taught her that defending her father would cost her more than she could pay when they got home. And in that silence, my girl, too frightened to speak up for her own father, I understood that this had gone far past insults I could file away. This man was going to spend the rest of my daughter's life making her smaller, and she was going to let him because she'd forgotten she was allowed to be large. I did not reveal myself at that table. I want you to understand that. Every instinct a lesser man has was screaming at me to lean across that tablecloth and tell Trent Marsh exactly whose company he worked for, exactly whose name was on the building, exactly whose signature was on the account his paycheck came out of, to watch his face collapse in front of everyone. I didn't, because a scene at a birthday dinner lasts 5 minutes and changes nothing. And because I've learned that the loudest move is almost never the one that ends things. So I smiled, and I said, "You're probably right, Trent. Happy birthday, sweetheart." And I let him pick up the check, which he did with great ceremony, on my company's money, without knowing it. And I drove home in my old truck in the dark, and somewhere on the highway, 45 years of a man who built something out of nothing sat up and got very, very calm. I want to be honest about what that calm is because I think it's the whole thing. It isn't rage. Rage is a young man's engine, loud, hot, and gone by morning. What comes over me is the opposite. It's the stillness I used to feel right before I closed a deal that couldn't be reopened. The whole loud world goes quiet, the noise drops away, and what's left is one clear line from where I'm standing to where this ends. I hadn't felt it in years. I didn't need it in retirement. But Trent Marsh had reached across the table and made my daughter disappear in front of me, and the old machinery woke all the way up. It was cold. It was patient, and it knew exactly what to do, because Trent had told me know my place. And the truth is, I know my place exactly. My place is at the top of the thing he'd spent 4 years climbing, thinking he was so close to owning it. He just had no idea I was already up there at the summit, watching him climb, and deciding that night that he just climbed his last foot of my mountain. If you're still with me, friend, do an old man that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what I found when I finally decided to look. Because a chairman who owns a company can see everything. And I had spent 3 years politely not looking at my son-in-law's work, out of some sense of fairness. That politeness ended on the drive home. The next morning, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I drove to headquarters. I parked my old truck in a visitor spot. I walked through the lobby, past the portrait of myself that nobody recognizes, and I took the elevator to the top floor, to the office of a woman named Hank Boyd, Henrietta, but she's gone by Hank for 40 years, who's been my company's president and my right hand since back when we had one building. Hank is one of maybe 5 people alive who knows exactly who I am and what I own. I sat down across from Hank, and I said, "I need to see everything on Trent Marsh, his whole record. Every deal, every review, every complaint. And I need it quiet." Hank looked at me for a long moment, because Hank has known me long enough to read the temperature. And she said, "Warren, I've been wondering how long it'd take you to ask." And she slid a folder across the desk that she had. It turned out already started building, because Hank had been watching Trent Marsh too, just from a different chair. What was in that folder took the cold thing in my chest and turned it to iron. Trent was not just an arrogant man who belittled his wife. Trent was a thief. For nearly 2 years, Trent had been quietly steering Meridian supply contracts, the contracts his whole division existed to award, toward a vendor called Apex Component Solutions. On paper, Apex looked like an ordinary supplier. It wasn't. Apex was a shell. An old college friend of Trent's had set it up, and it existed for exactly one purpose: to sit in the middle of our purchases, mark up the price, and split the difference. Every time Trent routed a contract through Apex instead of a real supplier, my company overpaid, and the extra flowed to a shell that quietly kicked a piece back to Trent. A few percent here, a few percent there, buried in the ordinary noise of 10,000 invoices. Over 2 years, it came to just under $400,000 of my company's money, walking quietly out the back door a nickel at a time. The big deal Trent had bragged about at dinner, the one that was going to change everything for us. It was the biggest Apex contract yet. He'd been about to close it the following week. But that wasn't even the part that told me who Trent really was. This was 8 months earlier. A young internal auditor named Devin Price had noticed something odd about the Apex invoices. Devin did exactly what an honest employee is supposed to do. He flagged it quietly up his chain, and the flag landed on the desk of the vice president whose division it concerned, Trent Marsh. And Trent, within 6 weeks, had manufactured a performance problem, built a paper trail, and fired Devin Price for not being a culture fit. A 29-year-old kid, honest to a fault, who'd spotted the theft, pushed out of my company, his career damaged for the crime of noticing, while the man who fired him sat across my daughter's birthday table and told me to know my place. I sat in Hank's office holding that folder, and I thought about Devin Price, a name I'd never heard until that morning. Some young man with a family, maybe, or a mortgage, or just the ordinary decency to say something's wrong when something's wrong. And my son-in-law had ended his job over it without losing a minute of sleep. And I thought about Claire looking down at her plate. And I understood that Trent Marsh had been doing the exact same thing to my company that he'd been doing to my daughter. Finding the honest, the trusting, the ones who wouldn't fight back, and quietly making them small, or making them disappear so he could keep taking. That's the thing about a certain kind of man. He doesn't have a work self and a home self. He has one self, and it does the same thing everywhere. It just wears a different tie. The man who will cheat a company he thinks is too big to notice is the same man who'll belittle a wife he thinks is too gentle to leave. It's all one appetite. I'd spent 3 years watching one half of it at my dinner table. The folder in my hands was just the other half, finally written down. I could have called security and had him marched out that afternoon. I had the authority. It would have felt wonderful for about a minute. But I didn't build a company over 45 years by taking the move that felt good in the minute. I took the move that ended things completely and cleanly, and in a way no lawyer could ever unwind. So I did it right. First, I had Hank bring our general counsel, a sharp woman named Sanaa Whitfield, fully into it, quietly. I told Sanaa I wanted the Apex scheme documented to the standard a prosecutor would need, not the standard a boardroom would accept. Every invoice, every markup, every dollar trace from Meridian to Apex to Trent. No confrontation, no warning, nothing that would let him start deleting things. Build it airtight, then move all at once. Sanaa understood exactly. It's how I've always operated. Second, I did something that mattered more to me than any of it. I had Hank call Devin Price. Not me, Hank as president, so it came from the company and not from mysterious old man. She offered Devin his job back, a promotion, back pay for every month he'd lost, and a written correction of his record. Devin, I'm told, was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then asked, carefully, whether this had anything to do with what he'd flagged 8 months before. And Hank told him the truth, that he'd been right all along, and that the company owed him a great deal more than an apology. He starts back next month, running the very audit function that Trent tried to destroy him for using. I've never met Devin Price. I probably never will. A chairman who wants the truth stays out of the lobby. But of everything that happened in those weeks, the phone call to that young man is the one I'm proudest of. Because a company is not its founder, and it is not its balance sheet. A company is whether it protects the person who tells the truth or the person who steals. For 8 months, mine had gotten that exactly backwards. That was on me for not looking. Fixing it was the only part of this that felt like anything other than sad. And third, I finally went and looked at the one thing I've been most afraid to look at. Trent's own words. Because Sanaa's team, in documenting the scheme, had pulled Trent's company communications, and in among the invoices were messages between Trent and his Apex friend that had nothing to do with the money, and everything to do with who Trent really was. He wrote about my daughter like she was a transaction. He wrote about Claire, she's low maintenance, doesn't ask questions, and the family's got old money somewhere, even if the dad's a joke. He wrote about me, about the man whose company was paying for the phone he typed it on. The father-in-law's a broke old fossil. Drove a truck his whole life, but the name Callahan still opens a few doors in this town, so he's useful enough to keep around. He wrote, planning the timeline of the big Apex deal, one more score and I'm set. Don't even need the marriage after that. Don't even need the marriage after that. He'd marry my daughter as a line item. A useful name, a low-maintenance wife, a stepping stone he planned to discard the moment the theft paid out. Every anniversary, every I love you, every quiet dinner where Claire looked at his face before she spoke. All of it, to him, was overhead on a transaction he was already planning to close. And he told me to know my place. I sat with those words for a long time. I read them more than once, the way you press on a bruise to be sure it's real. And that cold iron thing in my chest went very quiet and very sure, the way it used to go in the early years, right before I closed something that couldn't be reopened. There was no anger left in it by then. Anger is what you feel when you still hope you're wrong. I wasn't wrong. I'd known for 3 years. The messages just handed me, in his own typing, the permission I'd been waiting to give myself. I made my choice, and I want to be honest about it, because people question this part. I decided I would not tell Claire what I'd found in those messages. Not yet. Because I had learned, over a long life, that you cannot save a person by showing them a document. You can only give them a clear place to stand and let them find their own feet. So I built the clear place first. 2 weeks later, it all came due at once. On a Tuesday morning, Sanaa and legal moved. The Apex contracts were frozen. The evidence went simultaneously to our board and to the authorities because stealing $400,000 from company is not a family matter. It is a felony, and I was not going to let being Claire's father turn into anything softer than it was. And Trent Marsh was summoned to the top floor of Meridian Industrial, to the chairman's office. An office he'd never been in, on a floor he'd never had reason to visit, to meet the chairman he'd never once bothered to learn the name of. He walked in expecting, I imagined, some faceless executive. And he found me, sitting behind the desk, in one of my 3 flannel shirts. I will remember his face until the day I die. The confusion first. What is Claire's broke old dad doing in the chairman's office? Then the slow, dawning, horrible arithmetic as his eyes went from me to the nameplate on the desk, to the framed patents on the wall with a familiar name at the bottom, to the window with the building's name spelled out in steel just beyond the glass, and the whole impossible truth assembled itself in front of him, piece by piece, in real time. I watched a man rebuild his entire understanding of the last 4 years of his life in about 10 seconds. I watched him realize that every sneer, every impression at a barbecue, every coat he'd handed me, every know your place, had been performed directly into the face of the one man who could end everything he had, and that I had smiled through all of it and said nothing, and let him keep going. Sit down, Trent, I said, quietly, the way I'd said everything to him for 3 years. And I told him what I did for a living. I told him about a rented machine shop and 1 lathe and $11,000. I told him about Ridgeline and the portrait in the lobby he'd walked past 1,000 times without a glance, and exactly whose signature had been on the front of every paycheck he'd ever cashed to my company. I didn't raise my voice once. I've never had to raise my voice to a man in that chair. The chair does it for you. I just watched every ounce of that famous confidence drain out of him and pool on my office floor. And then I stopped talking about me, because that was never the point. I slid the folder across the desk. The Apex invoices, Devin Price's forced termination, and on top, printed clean, his own messages. Don't even need the marriage after that. He didn't try to talk his way out. For once in his life, Trent Marsh had nothing to say, because there's no charm that works on the man who owns the room, holding the proof when the proof is your own words. You told me to know my place, I said. So I'll tell you mine. My place is the top of everything you spent 4 years climbing. I've been up here the whole time, son, watching you climb, wondering if you'd ever, once, be decent to a single person who couldn't do anything for you. I closed the folder. You never were. Not once. That's the only thing I actually needed to know. He was walked out of my building that afternoon by the same kind of security he used to hand his coat to. He's awaiting trial now on the fraud. Whatever happens in that courtroom, he will never again spend a single day inside a company I own, and the town where the name Callahan opens doors is a town that now knows exactly what he did in it. Let me tell you about Claire, because that's the part that actually matters. I did tell her eventually, not with the folder. I'd learned that. I simply asked her to come by my house, and I made her coffee, and I told her I loved her, and I told her the truth, that I owned the company Trent worked for, that Trent had been stealing from it, and that I'd found things he'd written that she deserved to see when she was ready. And then I did the hardest thing. I slid one printed message across my kitchen table. Don't even need the marriage after that. And I let my daughter read it herself, and I did not say a single word while she did. She was quiet for a long time. And then my Claire, my kind, folded down, dimmed girl, set the paper down, and I watched something come back up in her spine that I hadn't seen since before Trent. She didn't cry, not then. She just looked at me and said, "How long have you known he was like this?" And I told her the truth. I knew what he was the first time I watched him make you smaller. I've known for 3 years. I was waiting for you to be somewhere you could see it too. I'm sorry it took me so long to build you that place. She looked at the wall of my kitchen for a while, and then she asked me the harder question, the one I'd been dreading. "Dad, did you take him down because of what he did to the company? Or because of me?" And I told her the only honest answer I had. The company gave me the right to act. You're the reason I did. She nodded slowly, like something was settling into place. And she said, "You could have just told me. At the dinner. You could have stood up and told everyone who you were and shut them up in one sentence." And I said, "I could have. And you'd have spent the whole ride home paying for it. And you'd have told yourself I was just being a proud old man, and nothing would have changed. I didn't want to win an argument. Sweetheart. I wanted you back. She's divorcing him now. She's painting again, really painting. A whole wall of my house is covered in canvases she's left here to dry, and the smell of turpentine is back in my kitchen for the first time since Peg died, and I'll tell you, it smells like the house is alive again. The gallery show is happening. And a couple of weeks ago, she stood up at a family dinner, in front of everyone, and told a long, funny story, loud and unafraid, wrong details and all, and nobody checked anybody's face before they laughed. And I had to get up and go stand in the kitchen for a minute, so she wouldn't see her old man come apart over the simple sound of my daughter taking up space in a room again. I spent 45 years learning one truth about people, friend, and I'll leave it with you, because it's the truest thing I know. You never find out who a person is by watching how they treat the people who can do something for them. Everybody's decent to the boss, to the rich man, to the one who signs the checks. You find out who a person is by watching how they treat the people they've decided are worth nothing. The broke old man, the honest young auditor, the quiet wife who won't fight back. That's the only test that's ever told me the truth. And it's a test you can only run if you're willing to be underestimated. So I've spent my whole life being underestimated on purpose. It's the most valuable thing I own. Trent told me to know my place. I've always known my place, son. I built it. I signed the front of your checks while you were busy reading the back. He spent 4 years certain he understood exactly who held the power at that table. He never once wondered why the quiet old man at the far, and never seemed worried about anything at all. Now here's my question, and I mean it because I go back and forth on it still. I let my daughter stay married to that man for months longer than I had to, because I believe she needed to find her own way out instead of being shown the door. Was I right to wait, to build her a place to stand and let her walk to it herself? Or does a father owe his child the ugly truth the moment he knows it, no matter how much it costs her to hear it before she's ready? I've argued both sides of it in my own head for a year. Tell me how you see it down in the comments. If this story meant something to you, do an old man that kindness, subscribe, hit like, and go pay attention to how the people in your life treat the ones who can't do anything for them. That's the whole truth about a person, right there. And if you're the quiet one at the far end of the table, stay quiet, stay watchful, and never let anyone convince you that being underestimated is the same thing as being small. I'll see you next time.